Well, I'm a Canadian. I was born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and that's a long ways from here, and many of you don't know where that is. We moved to the United States with my family, my wife Ruth, when I was 29, and we had two kids, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I remember crossing the border. We've loved living in Oregon and Seattle, Portland, Seattle area since then. But I go back to Canada quite a bit. And every time I go back, I know how to handle the border. I know exactly the questions they're going to ask. And so I was with two friends. We went back on one day trip up the west coast from the Portland area through to Vancouver, Canada. And you cross at a place called Peace Arch. And we were coming back through the Peace Arch crossing. There's thousands that cross there every day out of Vancouver down towards Seattle. And as Matt, who's driving the car, Morris, me, I'm sitting in the front seat driving shotgun. My buddy Scott is in the back. We pull up. We're getting the same questions we always get. And then he asks us, the customs immigration official says, do you guys have anything radioactive in your vehicle? Now, that is not a question you want to be asked at the border. And we're in a rental car, so all of a sudden, Matt, who's driving, is going, what exactly has been put into this car? And then the immigration official, reaches down and says, because my radioactive detector is going off right now. And so we're all sitting in the car kind of wondering what's going to happen next, and then he finally asks us a question that sort of lifts the anxiety factor in the car. He just says, has anybody in here had any medical tests done recently? And I thought back and I went, yeah, I have. I've had a medical test done recently. I had a brain scan done. And he says, you're the problem. Get out of the car. So I got out of the car. I went in. They held what looked like a Safeway scanning gun to my head and said, yeah, you're radioactive. Let me tell you how I got radioactive, okay? I had a brain scan done in Seattle not long before we crossed the border. And on the left side of the brain imaging scan you see here is a healthy brain. On the right side of the brain is an unhealthy brain. A healthy brain has blood flow to all the areas. It's symmetrical and healthy. An unhealthy brain that's been affected by drugs, heavy drug use, heavy alcohol use, heavy, maybe possibly into dementia, or had a concussion, or had a stroke, does not have blood flow to every area of the brain. So it looks like there's holes in the brain, but there's not. It's simply that there's no blood flow there. So they injected me with radioactive isotopes and then did a scan of my brain. So now you're wondering, well, what did your brain turn out like, the right or the left? My brain turned out just fine. They found a little ADD, which my wife kind of said, that's not really a surprise, and some anxiety because I was going through a difficult season in my life, but my brain came out okay. What I want you to do today is forget the scan of the brain, which is pretty intriguing. I would like to suggest it would be fantastic if we do a scan of your soul. So stop right now and shift into soul awareness and actually imagine if God, through the Holy Spirit, could give you a scan of your soul right now. What kind of stuff would show up in terms of soul care in your life? We talk about hardware and software. In the organization that I started 12 years ago in Soul Formation, we don't deal with hardware anymore, particularly with pastors and church leaders or Christian nonprofits. I'm not interested in hardware, performance, measurables, goals, planning. I'm really interested more in software. I'm not interested in the exterior world as much anymore, although I lived in that world as a pastor for 25 years. And we had to do a lot of exterior work to build a healthy church, as you do in your business. I'm interested in the inner world. And the inner world doesn't get the attention it needs. And that's why I've invested my life in trying to care for pastors and leaders over the last 12 years and to properly assess my own soul. So let's talk about the soul. When people come up to you and say, how are you doing spiritually? How does that make you feel? I don't like that question. That's a doing question. That's a question that puts me on edge right away and puts me into spiritual measurables like, how's my quiet time? Am I sharing my faith? Am I loving my neighbor? Am I reaching people out on the margins? And on and on. I want to ask people a different question, which comes all the way back in the history of the church to the holiness movement. How is it with your soul? When I ask people that question, they relax because it's not a doing question, it's a caring question. And it's a question that opens up so many things that need to be processed in the inner world. So let's move on and talk about the meaning of the word soul. When you came into this session and you thought it was on the word soul, you might have thought, that's typically what we talk about when we die and go to heaven and our soul goes to heaven. And actually that theology in the Bible is there. And yes, we do have post-mortem existence. After we die, we live forever. We talk about resting in peace and then coming back into the presence of God when the body's resurrected. But the meaning of soul in the Bible does not just refer to our eternal existence now that we've been created in the image of God and have a soul. The word soul actually refers, at least half the time in the Bible, to something completely different than your permanent existence. The word soul refers to appetite, desire, or crave. So there are scriptures around this all through the Psalms and out the rest of the Bible. In Isaiah it says, "My soul yearns for you." Nothing to do with living forever. It's about living right now. "My soul yearns for you in the night. In the morning my soul longs for you." And then in the Psalms, David says, "I spread out my hands to you. My soul thirsts for you like parched land," yearning, longing, thirsting, aching, seeking. That's soul stuff. Did you know that your soul is always needy? It is always asking for something. It is always asking you to tend to it, to care for it, to fill it. Your soul is asking you questions all day long as you live your life. And most of us are not listening to our soul long enough to know how needy it is and what it's asking for. So we go on with the meaning of the word soul, and we go to 3 John 2, and it gets compared to physical health. Dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health physically, and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along so well. So we have physicians for the body, but in the history of the church, we have physicians for the soul. Your pastor, more than being a program manager, or a manager of the staff, or a manager of the budget, or a person who serves on the board and helps make sure that board is functioning effectively, your pastor, first and foremost, needs to be a physician of the soul. And I want to suggest that those of us who are in business, in places of leadership, we can be focused on all the management of the exterior world, but I'd like to invite all of you to learn and grow and stretch into managing the inner world of your life and then the people who serve around you. To ask questions that give them time to process what's going on in their soul. Since they're living in your external world, your exterior world, and they're trying to manage that world, you need to take them to their interior world and give them time to think about that. That's part of our journey as people who lead Christian organizations, businesses, and nonprofits. Just J.I. Packer, the great theologian, said this: just as a physician must know physiology, the Christian leader, that's you, not just a pastor. The Christian leader must know what spiritual health is. So let's talk about the meaning of soul more by taking a look at what Patricia Brown said. The failure of leaders to deal with their own souls, their inner life, is deeply troubling. The destructive consequences from leaders who fail to work out of a deep sense of their inner self are staggering. Leaders have a particular responsibility to know what is going on inside their souls. For leaders, this means taking the journey in and down. And this is what we do with leaders on our retreats with soul formation, and this is what I encourage churches to learn to do more of, and this is what I'd love all of us to explore. How do we go in and down into our inner world rather than just living in our external world? As they become fully awake to the inner world, they come to know and understand what it is within that betrays them and those they strive to serve. If your soul is not healthy, you will betray yourself, and you will betray your family, and you will betray the people you're serving. you will betray your community. That's what Patricia is saying. If you're not dealing properly with the inner life, you are not dealing properly with the outer life. It shows up all the time. I've experienced this so much in my leadership that when my soul is not healthy, I'm not leading in a healthy way anymore. Dallas Willard says it this way: the soul is that aspect of your whole being that correlates, integrates, and enlivens everything going on in the various dimensions of the self. The soul is the capacity to integrate all the parts into a single whole life. It is something like a computer. You don't usually notice it until it messes up. Have you noticed it? Has it messed up in your life? It did in mine. And that's where I want to walk us all through today, is to help you understand what happens to us when it messes up. When I moved to Seattle, I met a friend right away. I actually met him before I moved to Seattle. He said, I'm from Seattle, and we were in another city, and he told me about his life in Seattle. He worked with Microsoft during the 90s. And he just looked at me and he said this: I sold my soul to Microsoft. I began to just ponder the city I was moving to, Seattle, the high-tech city. I would be on the east side. I would be 20 minutes from Microsoft. And my goal as a pastor was to work with people who were selling their souls to the wrong thing in the wrong place. You can forfeit your soul here and now, not just in eternity. When Jesus talks to people and tells them, watch out, you can lose your soul, I think we often think he's talking about eternal life, but he is talking about the here and now. I forfeited my soul. I forfeited my soul to the church. At the beginning of my book, I would like to just read to you what happened to me in the church. After leading in pastoral ministry for over 20 years, I absolutely hit the wall after moving to Seattle. I had this incredible run in Salem, Oregon, church that went from 1,000 to 3,000 over 13 years as a lead pastor and 4 years as a youth pastor before that. And in Seattle, in the matter of just a few years, I'm in a psychiatrist's office. I never thought that would happen to me. I sat down with Ruth, the psychiatrist came in, and he looked at us and he just said, how can I help you? And tears just started streaming down my face. And the first thing I blurted out in his office, and I will never forget this moment as I sat beside my wife, I just said, quote, I have totally and completely lost my way. Those were the first words out of my mouth as I spoke to the psychiatrist in the opening moments. Tears streamed down my cheeks. My wife sat beside me, a true soul friend. She walked with me over the past 3 to 4 years as I slowly but surely slid from optimism and joy in ministry to an extended season of painful disillusionment. I walked into the psychiatrist's office out of sheer despair. I had already been to a Christian therapist, but the depression and anxiety remains lodged deep in my soul. Somehow I had to find my way back to emotional and spiritual equilibrium. I never dreamed ministry disappointment would result in needing professional help as a necessary step to recover. I was overwhelmed by shame. All my life I'd been successful. I was successful as a little kid in sports. I remember winning the track and field trophy in first grade. The first thing that lit me up and said, I want more of this. And then as a teenager, when I became a Christian, I became the one they said, why don't you get up in front and share your testimony? Why don't you lead our youth group and become, back then we used to have a president of the youth group and a leadership team. And so I became the president of the youth group. Then I became president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship for the student side of things on my campus in Canada. Then I was asked by Youth for Christ to join their organization and become an executive director at age 24 in a city that didn't have a program operating. I remember trying to climb the ladder of success, always feeling some sense of anxiety inside, always being told, you're amazing, you do great things. I was successful socially. I was successful in academics. I was successful in athletics. And all was up and to the right all the way through my time in Salem until I was into my mid-40s, early 40s. And then I hit the wall. And then I wound up in this situation, something I never thought would happen to me. And you know what? It's shame that won't let us admit what's really going on in the dark side of our own souls. Everyone sitting in this room has some shame around an issue related to your soul. And if you're not processing that issue in the deep recess of your own soul, you're going to be stuck on the other side of health the rest of your life. You have to pay attention to what's going on inside and process that. That was my wake-up call that day. Prior to that, someone had said to me, back in the church, I served in Salem, Oregon for 17 years, someone looked at me in that church and said, "You're a golden boy. Everything you do turns to gold." And I said in my heart, and I didn't realize how dangerous this was, I said, "I am golden boy. Everything I do turns to gold." I thought God was in it. But when I hit the wall in Seattle and wound up in the psychiatrist's office, I came out of that with a fundamental reorientation in my life. I did not want to hear the word golden boy ever again. All I wanted to hear was, "You're not golden boy, you are the beloved son." That was an incredible shift for me from performance to being loved as my identity, and hence the birth of soul formation and helping other people move away from trying to be golden to understand that they're beloved. When Rick Warren came in here and sat down on this chair in our first session, there was one thing he wanted to pasture you through in the first 5 minutes, and some of you are wondering, what's going on here? And he simply wanted to say, you need to understand that you're loved and your identity can't come from anywhere else but that. So let's walk into some motivations that relate to our soul. I'm going to deal with three motivations that you need to get in touch with. And after I talk about motives, I'm going to talk about emotions, and then I'm going to talk about your pace in life. The first emotion I want you to pay attention to if you want to take care of your soul, 3 emotions that get twisted is the need to succeed. We all have a need to succeed. It's normal. But when that need to succeed takes over the whole focus of our life, then you begin to live with a focus that says, I seek to meet the expectations of others to ensure that they will respect me, that they will affirm me, that I will be respected. The need to succeed drives so much of what we do in our culture. You cannot bear the idea of failure if you're living from this motivation. You cannot even conceive of failure, yet beyond failure might be the very next best thing for you in your life. But we do everything we can to avoid it at all costs and think that we'll absolutely lose our way if we fail. Your identity is then tied to your performance on a daily basis. I heard the story of a successful salesperson for a company who managed it. And he was always hired effective, particularly men in his company, particularly men to manage his sales force. And somebody came to this manager and just simply said, how do you get such effective salespersons in your organization? And he just said to the person, well, I have the person come in and individually I interview them and I talk to them. And what? And then I asked them, tell me about your family. A very relaxed question. Well, I'd love to tell you about my family. I was born here. And, well, tell me about your home. Tell me about your dad. And at that point, he was listening very carefully. For if the person said, I didn't really have a great relationship with my dad, because that was what the question was about. Tell me about what your relationship with your dad was like. What did you guys? And he says, my dad disappeared, or my dad wasn't present, or my parents divorced, and I never had a dad presence in my life. He hired that man. He hired that man because he has a hole in his soul to know that he's valuable, and he is now going to prove it by his sales success in the organization. And he will turn the employer, the CEO of the sales organization, he will turn that person into his father figure and start doing what he wanted from his dad. That's dangerous territory for us who've grown up with a sense of, I need to succeed to have an identity. You need to move from the fear of failure and find the hope of personal achievement by placing and becoming anchored in God's acceptance and his unconditional love of you. You'll have to shift away from succeeding as your primary focus. The next is the need to be liked. This is where I got shipwrecked in my leadership. This is the relational engine. If the first need to succeed is the performance engine, this is the relational engine that some of us have in the room here today. And by the way, when I'm done, I'm just going to ask you to vote in on what's your default in your soul. Where do you go to the three that I'm going to highlight? The second one then is the relational engine. Your focus is on the need to meet expectations of others so that they will love you. And you have a huge need to avoid conflict. I just walk around all the time realizing how conflict avoidant I am at age 65. I know I look 40, but I'm age 65. The need to be liked has managed my life and damaged my soul. If success is focused on the task, motive number one, being liked focuses on relationships, number two. It's a driving fear of rejection. It's a driving fear of conflicted relationships with anyone and not knowing how to manage conflict. Some of you are sitting here saying, I have no problem managing conflict. I can fire people really easily. There are others of us sitting here today that are saying the hardest thing in my world is managing conflict with someone. So we become codependent, and this is the deal for people who live from this space. They have a high emotional intelligence, but their emotions are not their own. They have antenna up all the time saying, what are other people feeling? What are other people feeling? And they're adapting all the time in a codependent way to make sure other people are happy. Because if you're happy, I'm happy. Your happiness creates my happiness because I'm dependent on you liking me. So I live my whole life with the need to be liked. We look at Jesus, who models a self-differentiation as the way out. To be self-differentiated is to be effectively and meaningfully attached to people, but also to be detached enough to be able to speak the truth in love all the time. There's some of us as parents here who don't know how to parent our children well because we're too codependent to their emotions. So we're afraid of their conflict. I've got a grandson like that that's working me really hard these days. I want your phone, Grandpa. I just want to play more video games. And when you say no, you have an unhappy grandchild on your hands. And so it goes through all of the issues and experiences of life. The need to be perfect. You're saying, well, what is that? This is the improving engine. This is not the person up front that needs to succeed and open new territory. This is the person in the organization that looks at the territory and says, this is what needs to be fixed. This is broken. This isn't right. This isn't functioning. It can go all the way down to grade school when a person, particularly a young person that's conscientious for their handwriting or something, wants to perfect everything. And simply says, I want to have perfect handwriting. And the teacher comes along and says, oh, you have an amazing whatever skill in that. And the person says, I want it to be perfect. I like to be perfect. And then it transitions from there all the way through different experiences where we want to correct things and improve things and make them best, to keep our life in balance internally at a soul level, because we believe we'll gain respect by correcting things, fixing things, reforming things, be it a small thing like handwriting, all the way up to the strategic plan for your organization. It needs to be fixed. Our values aren't right. 3 things. It's time to vote in. Are you driven from a shadowy place in your soul with the need to succeed, the need to be liked, or the need to be perfect? Pick one. Raise your hand. I'll raise mine for number 2. I love the need to succeed. Raise your hands. I have a need to succeed. This is pastor work right now. We're going to have an altar call at the end, okay? The need to be liked. Raise your hand and confess your sin. Man, we have a lot of people here that need to be liked. You need to watch that. It's a beautiful thing, but it has a lot of danger when it's focused on you and not loving others and giving it away. And the need to be perfect, to reform, to get it right. And a lot of us, good, thank you. A lot of us could have voted in on 2, right? And some of us could have voted in on all 3. Couldn't we? I know I could. I know that when I shipwreck, I'm looking at all 3 and I go, man, I had a high need to succeed, a high need to be liked, and a high need to reform things and make them perfect. And it put me in such a tailspin in my soul level, I didn't recover for a long time. But on the backside of that was a wake-up call that brought emotional and spiritual health that I am absolutely in love with today. Let's talk about caring for your emotions. caring for your emotions. We live in a culture that discounts emotions. And I just want to say, okay, I think that probably the business world is a place where we're taught to discount emotions because they get in the way, because they're the fuzzy stuff that people don't want to talk about. So let's stay out of the emotional ditch. Let's not get wrapped around the axle in that part of our lives. I don't do emotions. My wife's a therapist. She does counseling on 3 days a week, probably does almost a full week of counseling in 3 days, gets through somewhere between 20 and 23 people in 3 days, and I have no idea how she does it. And I said, how do you handle situations when the man and the woman come in the room for marriage counseling, and the man sits down in the chair, and his wife sits down in the other chair, and my wife's talking with them, and she's trying to get at some emotions, and the man says, I don't do emotions. I don't have emotions. And my wife Ruth says, as the guy's wife is sitting there beside him, so what brings you to counseling? I'm really angry. Oh, that's an emotion. Let's start there. Do you know what that emotion reveals? That there's a ton of other emotions that never got dealt with. There's a ton of baggage underneath anger that has been triggered by other emotions that weren't tended to. And so the person says, I only know one emotion that's difficult, anger. Oh, there's probably 50 difficult emotions that we deal with in life. But when you don't deal with them well, discouragement, anxiety, fear, I could just go down the list. When you're not dealing with those emotions, sooner or later you're going to pop with anxiety, and when you pop with anxiety, you're going to pop with anger. And so she's trying to drill down and get him to face up to the emotional things that are going on in his soul. A lot of you are familiar with this material. We think of ourselves as physical and spiritual. So we teach people physical practices: eat right, exercise, sleep right. Those are 3. If you do those, you're well on your way. On the spiritual side, we say, man, you should be having time in the Word, time in prayer, share your faith, be in church, learn to give. Lots of spiritual practices that have been developed since Richard Foster wrote Celebration of Discipline. I now have a book on my shelf that probably has 40 spiritual disciplines. I think Richard started with 9. And now there's 40 spiritual disciplines that people go through, and I go, oh, that's just a little too much. Let's just dial it back. I agree. But spiritual disciplines, spiritual practices is my word, are really important. But do you know that when you're losing your way, you can be taking care of yourself physically, you can be taking care of yourself spiritually, and practicing all the things that are needed on both sides of that. And if you're not watching yourself emotionally, you're going to find out that there's things happening inside of you that aren't being taken care of that absolutely need attention. Feelings are our early indicators of value. You only feel around the things you value, whether it be a difficult emotion or a positive emotion, a helpful emotion, an enjoyable emotion. You only feel things around the things you value. If you don't value it, it doesn't trigger a feeling in your life. So your emotional life is the place where we get in touch with the things that need evaluation, the things that need attention. So let's just quickly remember that emotions are at the center of the Bible. Job talks about, in every case, you can go back to the book and you can find the word soul connected to an emotional word. So if you want to do soul work, you have to do emotional work. That's the way God made us. Job says, my soul is grieved. Some of you are sitting here today, you're saying, I'm deeply grieved. I need to process that. My coworker and close friend that I have worked with for the last 10 years was sitting on a deck in August. He's the executive director for Soul Formation. We depend on him so much. His office is right beside mine, and we've officed together for about 7 years now. He was leaning back in his chair, as some of us guys are known to do, push it back a little bit like this. He was there with his wife and his wife's sister, his sister-in-law. His sister-in-law's husband is a cop. He left 5 minutes before. Paul tipped back in his chair, went up against the fence along the rail. They're in Central Oregon in the middle of nowhere. Something breaks through. He goes down 7 feet. His head gets jammed up against a tree, and Paul's dead. I'm dealing with emotions. I'm dealing with a variety of emotions right now. I'm conflicted in many ways. And it made me realize the other day why I have a sheet that I keep close by that has about 200 emotions listed on it underneath the primary emotions, about 5 or 6 primary emotions, and then all of the emotions underneath. And I was trying to figure out why I'm so disoriented right now in my soul, why I'm experiencing desolation and not consolation, as Ignatius of Loyola taught us so clearly, leading the Reformation onto the Counter-Reformation, onto the Catholic Church side. I lean on him a lot. I love what he teaches. Why I'm in a season of desolation and not consolation. And I finally got out my feeling list and did what I do with every people on retreat. I pulled out the feeling sheet for me. And I said, what am I feeling? Question, oh Lord, I feel things that leave me in an experience of confusion. And then I wrote down the words that came off the sheet. Empty, disappointed, disillusioned, skeptical, anxious, and trapped. This is just a week ago. And some of you are saying, that's a lot of emotion, Morris. Well, I'll just go further. I also wrote down burdened, discouraged, afraid, uneasy, immobilized, stagnant, and alone. And some of you are saying, you really do have holes in your brain. I had to write those down. And as I wrote them down and looked over my emotional sheet of all the emotions I can look at, I suddenly began to register with my soul again. And I could do the work that I needed to do with God. Honestly, you guys, God felt far away that day to me and had for weeks. And on that day, when I named my emotions to him, I felt the presence of God for the first time in a long time. Do you do that? Job said, my soul is grieved. Samuel, the soul is bitter. Proverbs, the soul is weary. Lamentations, the soul is downcast. Matthew, Jesus says, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful. Psalms, my soul is rested, joyful, satisfied, rejoicing. Isaiah says, my soul is delighted. Jeremiah says, my soul is resting. The Bible is full of soul and emotion stuff all the way through. Do you know how critical emotions are in your life? Let me come back to my beautiful therapist wife, Ruth. When I come home from this conference, if I tell her how many people were here, and tell her how nice the hotel was or how it was laid out, and I tell her that the PowerPoint didn't come off without a glitch, and I tell her that my session sort of went okay, and I give her some other information, she's going to say, yeah, but how did you feel about the conference? What was it like for you? And suddenly I'll get down into the emotions that I felt. And I won't tell her about the space, and I won't tell her about the ocean. I'll tell her about what was going on inside of me. And do you know, in those relationships that are closest to us, with parents, with children, or with spouses, if you're a married person here today, relationships find intimacy because we share emotions. And your relationship with God finds intimacy because you share emotions with him. And that is why God loved David so much, and that is why we love the Psalms so much, because the Psalms are all about processing emotions with God. As you move through the Psalms, at least half the time, David is processing something on the positive side or the difficult side of his emotional life with God. We read this and like it, and then we don't do it. Why? I just think we're out of touch with our emotional self. The Bible characters are naming their emotions in the presence of God. We share our emotions with people and with close friends and with family members because we want intimacy. We share our emotions with God because we want intimacy. When you leave this place today and this afternoon and you have an extended time off, would you please just sit on the beach for at least 10 minutes and write down what you're feeling right now and tell God about that. Process it with him. If you don't process your emotions will process you. And they will manage your life, though you don't even know how or in what way they have managed your mind. You have got to bring them out into the open with God. I dare you to just Google emotional intelligence or Google heart intelligence. If you Google heart intelligence, you will find out that the Heart Math Institute has now informed us that the human heart has approximately 40,000 neural cells. It is a brain unto itself. The heart cells actually tell the brain cells at times, go away. You're not telling me the right thing. Heart cells are brain cells too in their own way. And so people say, you should listen to your gut. You should listen to your heart. You should consult your heart. How many times in leadership have you said, I had a gut feeling? I had a gut feeling that something was wrong in that area of our organization, a moral issue, something questionable was going on with that individual. I've had a gut feeling in church leadership, and then my wife will look at me and say, I had a gut feeling too, after we find out that the person's been involved in an affair and we're in a lawsuit at the church. And I said, I had a gut feeling about him. Your heart is speaking to you with intelligence. People get hired for IQ. They get fired for not enough EQ, emotional intelligence. If you don't exercise emotional intelligence, you can't lead your team effectively. Let's go to the last one that you need to pay attention to. The first two were watch your motives. Secondly, watch your emotions. And I want to wrap up by get in touch with your pace. Eugene Peterson said it this way. Listen to the counterintuitive truth that's coming to us from Eugene today. Busyness is the enemy of spirituality. It is essentially laziness. Now that's counterintuitive. Busyness is the enemy of spirituality. It is essentially laziness. It is doing the lazy thing instead of the hard thing. It is filling our time with our own actions instead of paying attention to God's actions. Do you know that when I sit down to have quiet space in my life and practice solitude, that I am always tempted to do something busy? I have the hardest time not grabbing my phone and going back to stuff that I want to do. The phone has invaded my part of my life where I need to spend time with God. My wife, when she spends time with me, says, guys, is this true? Put the phone down and talk to me. Put your computer away and talk to me. If you're going to have meaningful time with God, you've got to stop your pace long enough with the things that are coming at you from the exterior world. I went away on an 8-day silent retreat to an Ignatian monastery down here in California when I lived in Seattle. When I was getting into the car, I'd been thinking about this for at least a week. And when I was getting into the car, my son was driving me to the airport, SeaTac in Seattle. And I'm 1 minute away from getting into the car to drive with him to the airport, and my wife is there, and I'm saying goodbye to Ruth, and I finally pull my phone out of my pocket and have the courage to say to her, for the next 8 days, take this and take it now. If I'm going away on a silent retreat, this is going to wreck it. But do you know what I felt like as soon as I gave her my iPhone? As we were driving away, it felt exactly as if I had left my wallet behind. That's the same thing I felt when my phone wasn't in my right front pocket. It's as if my wallet was not in my back right pocket. Technology is wrecking us, and we must wake up. It's blessing us. I love the new stuff we're exploring here. I went to somebody right away afterwards and says, who are you? Give me your card. I want to know more about that. I want that app for our organization. But technology is turning us into people that are more hurried, more anxious, more uptight, more lacking centered focus with God and others. So what's hurry sickness? Hurry sickness is a continuous struggle and an unremitting attempt to accomplish more and more things in less and less time. Hurry sickness, more and more things in less and less time. How did Christ overcome hurry sickness? It said there were so many people around, they didn't even have time to eat. And so what Jesus did was he says to his disciples, get in a boat and go over with me to the other side of the lake. And it says in Luke 5:16, Jesus often went off to lonely places and prayed. So how many lonely places are there in our lives? I've been practicing solitude now for about 25 years, and I just want you to know, it's always a decision. When I went into my journal that day and wrote down my emotions, what then came to me was, it's been a long time since you've been alone at the monastery by yourself. And I now know after I go home from this event, I need some time alone to process what's going on inside of me with God. You can't do interior work on the fly. You can't do interior work while you're on your computer. You can't do interior work in front of the TV set. You can't do interior work until you are alone, relaxed, and centered and focused on God. And until you know you are absolutely beloved, and it's the safest place in all the world to process the things that you need to get out of the inside into God's presence, as David does in the Psalms. We'll never write our own psalm if we don't go off to a quiet place and take time to write it. And David gives us an invitation. Write a psalm. Go away. Be alone. Here's my favorite prayer to end my talk with you this morning. Almighty God, it's from John Bailey's book, A Diary of Private Prayer. Almighty God, in this quiet hour, I seek communion with Thee. From the fret and fever of the day's business, or busyness if you want to change it, from the world's discordant noises, from the praise and blame of men, from the confused thoughts and vain imaginations of my own heart, I would now turn aside and seek the quietness of Thy presence. All day long I have toiled and striven, but now, in the stillness of heart and in the clear light of Thine eternity, I would ponder the pattern my life is weaving. My favorite words around that prayer, which is my favorite prayer. I would ponder the pattern my life is weaving. That requires quietness and solitude so that you can go back to your emotions and so you can back to your motives and take a look at your whole interior life in the stillness of being before God, turning away from discordant noises, the praise and blame of men, the confused thoughts and vain imaginations of my own heart, turning away from the stuff that's creating anxiety in our lives and managing us rather than taking time together with God to manage our inner space and not just getting lost in the outer space around us. So I just end with this pastoral plea. I just want to pastor today. This is what I came up to do, to pastor you. Is that okay? Would you just stop and pay attention to your inner space? Would you pay attention to your soul? That is your inner space. That is what you have to wake up to. Thank you. It's just been an honor to share this information with you today. Thank you.